All right, so I'm going to give you, as Jack suggested, a brief overview of the ABA's Rule of Law Initiative and the work that we do around the world in more than 50 countries currently, and over the course of our history, we've been in 100 countries. The work that we do to advance the rule of law. And I like to think of ABA ROLI as really a global iteration of the ABA. So the work that we are doing in all of these countries around the world is very much the same work that you all do and that the ABA does here in the United States. And I think you'll see how that is the case. So our mission is to advance justice, economic opportunity, and human dignity through the rule of law. How do we do that? Always in partnership with local in-country partners in the justice sector. So that may be governmental actors or non-governmental actors. You won't be surprised to know that we work with a lot of bar associations around the world. That's a natural for us. There are really 4 general program areas in which we work. Judicial system strengthening, and this is really the whole justice sector, formal institutions of the rule of law. So bar associations, judiciaries, law schools. We do a lot of capacity building of those kinds of institutions, that foundation for the rule of law. We sometimes think of that as the kind of top-down parts of advancing the rule of law and advancing the supply of the rule of law. And then, importantly, we have to advance demand for rule of law, and that's where human rights and access to justice comes in. And this is really working with civil society, with legal aid in many of the countries who are working to create the bottom-up demand. We work in a lot of countries in transition from authoritarianism and from conflict, and so we've developed particular programming and expertise in managing those processes of change, a lot of work on constitutional reform, on transitional justice, accountability for gross violations of human rights, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the like. And importantly, confidence building in the institutions of government post-conflict. And finally, a new and growing area of work for us is inclusive and sustainable development. And this is looking at what are the legal frameworks that guarantee that development is going to be shared, economic development is going to be shared across the population in equitable and just and fair ways, and that it is sustainable, environmentally, socially sustainable over the long term. We work in more than 50 countries, and working with ROLI, we have anywhere between 500 and 700 people at any given time. Why the variation? Well, it depends on how many volunteers are deployed at any given time. But typically our base staff is about 500, both staff and consultants, short and long term. And the vast majority of those folks are local lawyers we hire in the countries where we're operating, who support the programs that we are doing there. And we are funded, as Jack mentioned, principally through grants and cooperative agreements. Most of our funding, about 90% of our funding, comes from the U.S. government, and the other 10% from other governments, particularly the Nordic governments. The Dutch have been supportive, the Norwegians, the Swedes of our programming, and then a number of private foundations and individuals. As I mentioned, a key principle of our work is partnership. We don't go anywhere where we are not invited and where there is not a willing partner to work with ABA ROLI in advancing the rule of law. Sometimes that's governmental partners, ministries, police, prosecutors, judicial training institutes, judicial associations. Sometimes there are specialized reform commissions working on issues like corruption or cyber crime, and law schools, of course. Like our legal ed division here at the ABA, law schools are an important constituency for us. And then we work with non-governmental partners on that bottom-up demand side. So this is non-governmental organizations, legal services NGOs, human rights NGOs, women's rights NGOs, lots of bar associations. In some countries, the bar associations are governmental entities. government-controlled and government ministries or institutions and other places. They are more like the ABA, independent, and so they're in that NGO category. And then, of course, Defense Council and legal aid. We work, those four kind of broad areas I described are programs, but we have kind of more finely defined practice groups that you may think correspond in some ways to sections. And the sections and forums of the ABA are often important partners for our staff and colleagues and volunteers working in these areas. And they're listed here, covering a broad range of topics we have found are really critical to fostering the rule of law. What kinds of activities do we actually undertake? It really depends on what those partners are asking for and looking for. So we really pride ourselves not only on working only where we're invited, but developing solutions that are responsive to the needs of those local partners and what it is that they want. So that means some places it's an assessment of the current state of law or an institution that's critical to the rule of law in that country. Sometimes it's advice and support for legal and regulatory reform. And I should say, importantly, we are not about simply exporting an American model. We recognize that our model is one among many, and often not the most relevant or appropriate for a particular country, given its own legal traditions and history. And so we will usually cite to international standards and then provide a range of models and options for our partners to consider as they undertake their own legal and regulatory reform. An important part of what we do everywhere where we work is training and educational programming, very much like the ABA does through all of its different entities and CLE and the like. Training and educational programming is critically important to advancing rule of law. And we do that in partnership, often trying to develop the capacity of local partners to carry on the training after our program. So lots of training of trainers initiatives so that they can sustain programming over the long term. And increasingly, we are working on developing for our local partners online platforms so that trainings have a shelf life and are not just one-offs. And they can reach broadly into the countries where we work. They're not just concentrated in capitals, but lawyers working in the regions of any given country can access those training and educational opportunities. In a number of countries, we are also doing kind of more infrastructural development. We don't build courts and that sort of infrastructure development. That's better suited to other kinds of implementers. But we do help with capacity building, particularly, I would say, of bar associations and judicial associations through these online learning platforms, developing their capacity to carry these programs forward. We have a very large program right now in the Philippines where we are introducing electronic case management to that court system in 10 of their busiest courts, and introducing computers and computerized management of cases there. I visited it a little less than a year ago, and the transformative impact of simply introducing computers in the courtroom is really remarkable. And processes that would in the past have taken weeks or months to complete, and for the litigants to get information about their case, to get an order, to be able to move forward in a case, were now happening in front of everyone's eyes in a matter of minutes in those courtrooms, and because of this assistance that we had provided. So that's there's a hardware component of that, of course, introducing the computers and the technology and wiring all the courtrooms and so on. And we work through some contractors to do that. But then there's an important technical assistance, and that's really the ABA's strong suit in bringing expertise in court management and judicial assistance there to train the judges, the court clerks, and how to use this equipment. I should say that a couple of ABA colleagues here, Peter Kaling, has been out to the Philippines to advise the judiciary there on how to use that new system in ways that have really been impactful. And he couldn't be here today to give you a personal testimonial, but I think that's an example of the kind of technical assistance that we bring to bear. That really goes to institutional strengthening as well. Let me just give a few examples of the kinds of programs, 3 or 4 programs that we have ongoing right now to make this a little bit more concrete. So folks have probably all heard about the really kind of horrific crime situation in Central America and the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and murder rates that top those of anywhere in the world. And then that is, of course, resulting in the flows of migrants that we see coming north to escape that gang violence. One of the challenges that our justice sector partners in El Salvador and Guatemala in particular have indicated they have in responding to this rampant crime is the lack of capacity to use forensic evidence effectively. And it's a problem that really stretches throughout the entire justice system. And they have quite good forensic medical capacity, but the first responders, it turns out the fire departments are often the first responders in this context, weren't trained in how to protect the crime scene, and sometimes would botch the evidence there. And so first responders needed to be trained. Prosecutors and investigators needed to be trained on what forensic evidence can tell them and what it can't tell them. And then prosecutors need to know how to use that evidence in court, and judges need to know how to evaluate it. And so we have developed in both El Salvador and Guatemala extensive programming around this problem, developing the capacity of the forensic institutes to gather and protect evidence effectively, and then of all those other justice sector actors to use it well as well. That's one example from this hemisphere. Moving to Africa, another example of our programming, which might be of interest to folks here thinking about the Futures Commission, for example, in the ABA, and some of the challenges that we face in our country about expanding access to justice, particularly for rural communities or poor communities. This is a problem also in many of the countries where ROLI is working. So in Guinea, and this is typical of many of our legal assistance programs in many countries, we have worked with some non-governmental actors to create new legal aid centers and train pro bono lawyers and also paralegals to work in these centers and go out into the countryside and provide legal counseling, particularly to women and girls who are often excluded from those kinds of services and don't have access to those kinds of services. So that's another example of programming that we have undertaken. I mentioned the work that we do on transitions, and there's a lot of transition going on, some of it quite bumpy, in the Middle East these days. And we've been very active in many of those processes in providing expert advice on new constitutions And then once constitutions are adopted, undertaking broad-based educational programming for the legal sector and also for the general public about what these new rights are and how do you access them. We've done that work in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt and Morocco. And again, the focus here is often trying to give access to those constitutional reform processes for those who might otherwise be excluded from them, so that they feel a stake in the new government system. So in Libya, for example, we have supported a network of women lawyers, maybe a little bit like our Commission on Women in the Legal Profession here in the United States, a network of women lawyers to provide, both to evaluate their own status and the status of women under the old order, and then to make recommendations about provisions in the Constitution going forward. And here, a final one that I think will resonate well here. And again, I think there's lots of room for brainstorming about how we can do more of this. We work with bar associations almost everywhere where we work. And you'll be proud to hear that the ABA is really held in high regard and is the envy of our bar association colleagues all over the world. And they're very interested in the resources and information and practices and experience that you all have and that we as an association have. So we have worked in a number of countries to unify the bar. In many countries didn't have a bar association in the past, or had different associations for different parts of the legal profession, whether it's prosecutors or defense lawyers or commercial lawyers, and have moved toward unified bars. And we, of course, have that experience here in the United States and are able to share that with our colleagues. We've worked on licensing for bar admission and administration of tests for bar admission. I was just in Armenia week before last, and that is a legacy of our work there over the last 20 years, is that we helped set up the Bar Association and set up its licensing and annual test process. We currently are fostering a network of bar associations in the Balkans. So you'll remember 10, 15 years ago, the people of the Balkans were at war. And today we have the Balkans Regional Rule of Law Network that is knitting the bar associations of those countries together. And I was with William Hubbard in Belgrade almost a year ago to the day for a signing ceremony of a friendship agreement among the bar associations of those former warring states. And it was really quite remarkable that in that relatively short period of time, we have seen a transition in that part of the world, and now very constructive and collegial relations between the Bar Association of Kosovo and the Bar Association of Serbia and the Bar Association of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And those bar leaders coming together and thinking about how they could support each other in some of the common challenges that they face, advocating for the independence of the bar in each of their countries, developing an online learning platform that they could share, since they all speak more or less the same language. There's some efficiencies to be gained by sharing educational programming among themselves, and is really an interesting model for regional programming and the support of bars across a region. Some of you may have been at the mid-year meeting in 2015, a year ago, where we were seen us hosting a delegation of the Sri Lankan bar. And this has been another really happy success story for us over the last year. You may have followed that Sri Lanka had a transition in its government a little over a year ago, quite remarkable democratic transition, and a real opening and hopeful moment in the governance of that country. And the Bar Association and the independent lawyers who enforced the election law in that first democratic election in a long time there, the Bar Association was critically important and continues to be an important force for for change there. And we have been supporting them at every step of that way. They came to our mid-year meeting, and colleagues here at the ABA facilitated their attendance at all the NABE and all the bar capacity building meetings at the mid-year meeting. Jackie Casey gave them a training on raising funds, which was great. And we continue to support their efforts. Alan Rosen, I think, is just back maybe today from spending a week in Sri Lanka, where she was advising them on ethics codes and enforcement of standards for lawyers. So that is, as I say, something that really is special about the ABA in this rule of law development work. There are lots of other actors working on advancing legal reform and rule of law, but there's nobody else, no other implementer of U.S. development assistance that can marshal the kinds of resources and expertise that we can because of all of you and the work that you do with volunteers in the ABA. Which brings me to maybe summarizing a few ways in which we do tap those resources, and really to invite your thoughts about how we can do more of that. So, as I've suggested in a couple of ways, we tap our member and staff expertise and resources. So our model rules and standards are something that our colleagues, our justice sector colleagues in other countries, are very keen to see and understand and use as models for their work. And often taking the members or the staff experts on those standards to our countries of operation, or having them brief our partners when they come to the United States, is critically important to folks understanding how standards work in practice and how a bar association plays a role in advancing standards. Those pro bono and consultant opportunities are also an amazing member benefit. So if any of you had members who participated in ROLI programs, you'll know that it can be a really transformative experience for your members. And it's something that we within ROLI are interested in expanding the pool of members who are contributing to this work, and the connection that then they feel to the association as a result of that. We also like to work with lots of different entities on co-sponsored programs. So we have done programs at the mid-year meeting. We worked just a few weeks ago with the Young Lawyers Division, and I think the Commission on Immigration was involved in a program that was looking at the refugee and migrant crisis. And we within ROLI are working both on the root causes, for example, the program in Central America that I described, and a number of other countries. We also work on marshaling legal assistance to refugees. So in Turkey, we have a program now that is providing legal aid, working with the Turkish bar associations to provide legal aid to Syrian refugees who are coming to Turkey and are having a hard time finding their way and accessing their legal rights because they don't have access to a lawyer. And it's very much like the pro-bar work that the ABA does in the southwestern part of the United States, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. So joint programming of that nature to discuss those rule of law challenges that we face here in the United States and around the world can be quite interesting. And we're happy to do that at our big meetings or in one-off programming, either here in Chicago or in Washington, or at other section and entity conferences. And finally, and this I think is a growing area of opportunity for us to work with other ABA entities, we're seeing that many ABA entities are hitting the road and showing up even in some of the remote parts of the world where ABA ROLI has programs. And that's marvelous. And we're eager to work with other entities and really knit this global community of lawyers and rule of law advocates together. So if you are and working with an entity that is putting together a program in a ROLI country of operation, don't hesitate to be in touch. For example, just in November, we worked with both the section of international law and the criminal justice section. They were having back-to-back conferences in Beijing and Shanghai. And Paulette Brown, President Brown, went to Beijing for the section conference. And we were very happy to support through our Beijing office those initiatives in China. And we've supported conferences in many other parts of the world. And frankly, I see this as a critical strategy for rule of law development, is that while ABA ROLI can provide a training or assistance to a justice sector partner, the long-term strategy for really supporting the legal profession around the world is through our bigger association and through fostering ties between ABA ROLI's justice sector colleagues in our countries of operation and all the other relevant sections, entities of the ABA, so that judges with whom we're working in our countries of operation become members or affiliated or attendees of the judicial division, that prosecutors and defense lawyers are engaged with our criminal justice section, and so on. And I think that that is a very exciting vision of the future, that the ABA could become a meeting place for a global community of lawyers who are committed to the rule of law. Just to illustrate the impact of that member engagement in our programming, as I said, about 200 judges and lawyers are kind of constantly going out and engaging in our program. Some of them do that work here, reviewing a draft law or constitutional provision, but often it is traveling to our countries of operation. And that pro bono assistance is between 2 and 3 million a year, contributed through ABA ROLI. And there's information about those kinds of pro bono opportunities on our website. And I'm keen to work with individual sections, entities, to publicize those pro bono and volunteer opportunities to your members and get them involved in and aware of ROLI. I'll just end really on that note, which is to invite questions and suggestions for collaboration. We within ROLI, the staff and our leadership, volunteer leadership, have been over the last year undertaking a strategic planning process, looking at what our strengths are and where we need to strengthen our efforts and where we really see the rule of law development field going. And one of the really key takeaways from that process has been this distinguishing factor of ABA ROLI is the ABA part of our name, as I mentioned earlier. And so we're really looking to kind of double down on that if it's possible, and to strengthen our ties with other entities. And I'm very keen for invitations to have our leadership come speak to your entities about ABA ROLI, about ways in which we can work together, thinking together about fostering joint programs to advance the rule of law around the world, to have CLE or other programming at our conferences, to grapple with some of the challenges that we see in rule of law, and how the ABA can and is responding.